The letter from the agency had arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Maren Collier discovered that her sister had not kept any of the furniture. Not even the small pine table their mother had used for rolling biscuit dough, the one with the flour pressed so deep into the grain it had turned the wood pale in a long oval. Maren had stood in the doorway of the house she'd lived in for 11 years, her late husband's house, technically, which was how his family had always referred to it, and understood that the emptiness was not accidental. The chairs were gone, the curtains, even the hook she'd hung her coat on every morning since she was 31 years old. She had not made a sound. That was the thing she would think about later, riding the train west with a trunk that was more than half air. She had not made a sound, had simply backed out of the doorway and pulled the door shut behind her with both hands, the way you close a door when there is a sleeping child inside and you do not want to wake it. The agency letter had been sitting in her coat pocket for 4 days by then. She had been meaning to read it again, to decide. Now she read it standing on the porch of a house that had been emptied of every sign she had ever existed inside it, and she decided. Her name in the letter was spelled wrong, Maren instead of Maren, and she had noted this with the small, tired acknowledgement she gave to most things that did not go quite right. She did not write back to correct it. It didn't seem worth the effort of explaining. The man's name was Caleb Marsh. He was 48 years old. He ran cattle on a property in eastern Montana called the Granger Flat, a name that meant nothing to her, but that she repeated quietly to herself on the train because it sounded like a place where a person could be unremarkable in peace. He had written 4 lines to the agency. He needed a woman who could manage a household. He was not looking for conversation. He would provide room and board and whatever else was reasonable. He understood this was a practical arrangement. She had read those 4 lines 7 times and found them honest. The train took 2 days. She sat by the window with her hands folded and watched the land flatten and then flatten further, as if the earth itself were pressing down into something patient and unbothered. She ate the bread she'd packed. She did not speak to the woman seated beside her until the woman asked if she was going all the way to Miles City, and Maren said yes, and the woman nodded and looked out her own window, and that was the whole of it. She was 44 years old. Her hair had gone the color of creek water in winter, pale brown going silver at the temples, and she kept it pinned close to her head because loose hair had always seemed like an announcement she had no business making. She was not small, but she had learned to take up less space than her body actually required. She folded herself into corners. She angled her shoulders. She apologized for standing in doorways even when no one was trying to get past her. At Miles City, there was a man with a buckboard and a handwritten card with her name on it, spelled wrong again. She did not correct him either, just climbed up onto the seat when he gestured at it and set her trunk in the back herself before he could offer, and they drove for an hour and a half without speaking, which she found she preferred. The house was plain and low, made of wood weathered to a soft gray. There was a barn behind it and a small structure she took to be a root cellar and a garden space that had been turned but not planted. The man with the buckboard was not Caleb Marsh. He left her at the front step and drove away. She stood there with her trunk for perhaps 3 minutes before the door opened. Caleb Marsh was taller than she'd imagined, which was not why she noticed him first. She noticed him first because he looked at her with no expression she could classify. Not disappointment, not relief, not the particular kind of appraisal she had learned to expect from men who were trying to decide whether she was worth the trouble. He looked at her the way a person looks at weather coming in from the north, with attention rather than judgment. "Miss Collier?" he said.
Yes. She almost said sorry after it, out of habit, though she could not have said what she'd be apologizing for. He took her trunk without asking and carried it inside. The house smelled like wood smoke and something she couldn't name, something dry and plain. He set the trunk in a room off the kitchen. There was a bed and a window and a washstand. The curtains were feed-sack cotton, faded to near white, and they moved in the draft from the door. "This is your room," he said. "Supper is at 6.
She unpacked alone. She placed her 3 dresses in the wardrobe and her brush on the washstand and her mother's Bible, the only thing she'd taken from the house before her sister stripped it, on the shelf above the bed. She sat on the edge of the mattress and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed through her nose until she felt something in her chest go quiet. She was not afraid. That was the strange part. She was not afraid, but she was braced, the way you are braced when you are waiting for someone to tell you where the edges of things are. She came out at 5:30 and began supper without being asked, because she could see what was in the kitchen and she understood what needed doing. He was sitting at the table with papers spread out before him, some kind of account ledger, and he did not look up when she came in, and she was glad of it. She made salt pork and the last of some dried beans she found soaking in a crock, and cornbread from meal in the bin. She set his place and her own and stood to the side until he looked up and folded the ledger closed. They ate without much conversation. He asked if the room was suitable. She said it was, thank you. He asked if the trip had been long. She said 2 days. He nodded, as if this confirmed something he already knew. She washed the plates after. He was still at the table when she finished, reading something, and she said good night, and he said good night, and that was that. In her room, she lay on top of the covers with her boots off and her hands on her stomach, and stared at the ceiling until the light outside went completely dark. She thought about the pine table with the flour in the grain. She thought about the hook by the door. She thought, in a careful and controlled way, about the 11 years of small erasures that had preceded the large one, the way her husband's family had always spoken past her to him, the way her own suggestions about the garden, about the hens, about which road to take to town, had been received with a kind of polite non-hearing, as if her voice came in on a frequency that was just slightly outside human range. She was not bitter about it. She had stopped being bitter about it a long time ago, which was its own kind of quiet loss, the loss of even the energy to grieve. She told herself, "You are temporary here too. That is fine. Be useful. Don't take up space. When it ends, it ends." She slept better than she had in months. The days shaped themselves around work, which she understood. She cooked and cleaned and found the kitchen garden and began to extend it, pulling grass and breaking new ground with a spade she found in the barn. There were 2 ranch hands who ate with them at noon, but not at supper. Their names were Dix and a younger man called Pete, and they spoke to her the way men usually spoke to her, which was directly through her toward whatever they actually wanted, addressing questions about the biscuits to Caleb even when she was the one standing at the stove. She did not mind it. It was familiar. Caleb Marsh watched his land the way other men watched the sky. He was gone most of the day, came back at dusk with the particular tiredness of a man whose work is physical and continuous. He did not talk much at supper, but he was present at it. He stayed at the table after with his coffee or his ledger, and she washed dishes with her back to him, and was aware of his presence the way you are aware of a fire when you are not cold, not urgently, just aware. 2 weeks in, she broke one of the larger crocks. She was moving it to clean behind it, and her grip slipped and it hit the floor in 3 pieces, and she stood there looking at it and felt the old familiar rehearsal begin in her chest, the rapid calculating of fault and apology and how to make herself as small as possible in the accounting of it. She was already saying, "I'm sorry," when Caleb came through the back door, and she said it again, "I'm sorry, I broke the crock, I'll find a way to replace it," and she was not crying,
but she was holding herself in a way that looked like someone who was considering it.
He looked at the crock. He looked at her. "It was cracked already," he said. "I've been meaning to get rid of it." She stood very still. "I should have told you," he said. "Sorry for the trouble." He got the broom himself and swept the pieces up, and that was all. She thought about it that night, and the next morning, and the one after that. Not the crock, the way he'd said it. He should have told her. As if the fault were in his failure to communicate, rather than in her dropping it. As if she were not the only available object of blame. She turned it over carefully, the way you turn over a stone you're not sure about. The garden was coming in. She had planted onions and carrots and a long row of beans and some squash along the south fence. He noticed on a Thursday morning when he was going to the barn and stopped and looked at it from the gate without comment. And she was on her knees tying up the bean plants, and she waited for him to say something about it. "The beans'll need more water," he said finally. "I know," she said. "I was going to dig another channel from the well." He stood there a moment longer. "You've done good work here," he said.
She almost said it didn't matter. She almost said sorry, as though claiming credit for something were an imposition. She pressed her lips together and said, "Thank you," and he nodded and went to the barn. That was in May. By June, she had stopped setting her things at the edge of the washstand and had spread them out across the whole surface, the way a person does when they have stopped expecting to need to pack quickly. She began to take her coffee outside in the mornings. There was a step at the back of the house where the light came in low and long, and the air smelled of grass and the distant cattle. She sat there with both hands around the cup and did not think about anything in particular, which was a practice she had never allowed herself before, the practice of not thinking, of simply being located in a place without trying to justify the occupation of it. Caleb came out one morning and stopped when he saw her. She began to rise instinctively, to cede the step, and he said, "Don't," not unkindly. He went back inside and came out with his own coffee and sat on the ground beside the step with his back against the post, and they watched the morning come in for a quarter of an hour without speaking. It was the most comfortable she had been in another person's company in longer than she could accurately remember. She began to notice the way he noticed things. He noticed when she had reorganized the pantry, and he did not comment on the change directly, but asked 2 days later where she'd put the salt, and when she told him, he went directly to it without having to look. He noticed when she had a headache, she had not mentioned it, and left a tin of willow bark tea on the kitchen table without explanation. He noticed that she preferred to do the mending in the early evening rather than the afternoon, and he had adjusted without announcement when he brought things in that needed mending. None of it was dramatic. That was what moved her eventually, not any one thing, but the accumulation of unremarkable attentions. In the third month, one of the hands, Dick's, made a comment at the noon meal about the bread being too dense. He said it to Pete rather than to her, the way you describe a problem with equipment to the man who owns it rather than to the tool itself. She heard it and felt the familiar compression in her chest and began to assess whether he was right and how to correct it and how to apologize for it. Caleb said, "I've found the bread fine," and returned to his meal. Dix made no further comment. She had come around the corner of the barn in the afternoon looking for the trowel she'd left somewhere, and she heard Caleb talking to the man from the agency, a man named Hollis, who came through every few months on some kind of circuit. She had not known he was coming. She stood against the side of the barn, and the words came to her in pieces, the way words do when you are afraid to hear them whole. Hollis was asking how the arrangement was working out, whether it had gone to his satisfaction, whether he had considered making it permanent, or whether he needed to speak to the agency about alternatives.
She stood very still against the barn boards and waited. She had been right. She had been right to stay braced, to not unpack herself too thoroughly, to remember that she was, at bottom, temporary. She had been foolish about the washstand. She had been foolish about the step in the morning and the beans and all of it. She felt it move through her, not violently. She was past the violent feelings, but steadily, like a cold front. She did not wait to hear Caleb's answer. She went back to the house and stood at the kitchen window and told herself, in a very clear and level voice inside her own head, "You knew this. You knew this from the beginning. Be clean about it. Don't make it into something." "You've been a good partner in this," he said. "The garden, the house, the way you manage things. I'd be a fool to let that go. I'd be worse than a fool." She sat with that. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are," he said. "I'm just saying what's true." She had prepared a number of responses. She had been composing them, without meaning to, since she'd stood against the barn wall. She'd had apologies ready and grateful minimizations and the soft reassurances she typically offered to smooth the edges off any situation that felt as though it might require something from her. She had all of those ready, and she did not use any of them. "All right," she said. "Not thank you. Not I'm sorry for assuming. Not I hope I haven't been a burden. Just all right." He picked up his fork. She picked up hers. They ate supper in the ordinary quiet that had become ordinary between them, and she washed the plates after, and he sat at the table with his ledger, and when she said good night, he said good night, and she went to her room and stood at the window and looked out at the dark land under the stars, the long, flat dark of eastern Montana, and breathed. The following week, she wrote a letter to the agency to inform them that the arrangement was settled. She did not ask Caleb if he wanted to write it himself. She wrote it because it was her life being arranged, and she understood that it was hers to arrange. She signed it with her name spelled correctly. The garden came in well that summer. She found she had opinions about how to extend it for the following year. A second turn of ground along the east fence, perhaps some medicinal herbs she'd read about, a cold frame for starting seeds early. She mentioned these things at supper, just plainly, without preamble or apology, or the trailing softness she'd always used to make her suggestions sound like questions. She just said them. He asked about the cold frame, what it would need, how she'd build it. She told him. He said he had some extra lumber from the new fence work. She said that would do. That was how it happened. Not in a gesture, not in a moment. In lumber and bean rows and morning coffee and the patient accumulation of being heard. In September, she got a letter from her sister. It was brief and did not contain an apology, which she had not expected. Her sister said she hoped Maren was well. She said the house had been sold to a family from Ohio. Maren read the letter once and put it in the tin box she kept on the shelf beside her mother's Bible, in the same way she kept other documents, carefully, without drama, because it was part of the record of her life, even if it was not a pleasant part. She thought, briefly and without much heat, about the pine table, about the flour in the grain. Then she went outside to the garden and worked until the light was gone. The evenings were cooling by then. She had started a second pot of coffee after supper, which was a habit he'd begun to count on. She could tell by the way he came back to the kitchen after a while if she hadn't made it, looking at the stove with the expression of a man recalculating. She made it because she wanted to make it, because she had come to like the smell of coffee in the evening and the particular quality of the darkness coming in through the kitchen window, and because it was hers to decide, the small domestic arrangements of her own life. One evening in October, he told her, without looking up from his ledger, that the east field had done better than he'd expected, and he was going to put in more acreage in the spring, and he'd need her help planning the vegetable supply for the additional hands. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without theater, as though it were obvious that her planning was part of the equation, as though her knowledge of what a household needed was a thing he relied upon. She felt something in her chest go open very slowly, like a window that has been painted shut for years and finally gives. She did not wait anymore. She did not apologize for the space she took up. She spoke when she had something to say at her regular volume, which was still quiet by most measures. She had not become someone else. She was still a woman who chose her words carefully and preferred the company of morning light to most conversation. But the quiet was different now. It was not the quiet of someone making herself small. It was the quiet of someone at rest. She told Caleb one night during one of those after-supper silences that she thought the cold frame should go on the south side of the garden rather than the east.
He looked up. "More sun," she said. He considered it. "You're probably right," he said. She nodded and looked back at her mending. Outside, the wind moved across the flat. The lamp held steady. She pulled the thread through and did not say sorry, and did not say, "I might be wrong," and did not say, "Never mind." She just let it be what it was, her thought, spoken plainly, in her own voice, in her own house, in the quiet that was finally hers.